Speaking of overreactions from week one, I think there's a lot of overreactions being done in regards to Alabama for the bad and maybe for Florida State for the good. Let's talk about Alabama first. Um, watching that game live, I think that there's a lot, without a lot of context, it's shocking to watch. Partially because we're used to an Alabama team from the Nick Saban era, from the pre-NIL era, just killing everybody. And this is a 2-10 team. I'm going to let you get into that in a second. That they're struggling with. But I think that Alabama fans need to take a beat and consider a couple of things. First of all, there are some concerning things regarding maybe less material considerations like fire and drive and effort and physicality and speed and tackling that I think are a potential problem. But there also needs to be considered the fact that, this game, until that last score, which was really late in the game, aided by a stupid penalty, this was a one possession game. It didn't feel like it. It felt like Alabama was getting run out of the building by 30 points. And I think that's because of how the game started. And I'm pretty sure that the quarterback felt that and the coaching staff felt that. And that's why Ty Simpson ended up with 43 passing attempts. But, Josh, I want you to talk about first. There's a couple of things that we can talk about in this game. But first, I want you to talk about, and look, this is no excuse. We're going to say very nice things about Florida State. I'm just trying to give some perspective on this game. Talk about the fact that for Alabama, they had two injuries, one on defense and one on offense, that happened right before this game and were probably the two most important people on each side of the ball, maybe short of Ty Simpson, for this game, like the worst possible injuries that they could have had. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, Daniel, I am going to interject a bit and just say, we're going to talk about it in a minute, but I think there's not nearly enough credit given to Florida State of what they are. And you mentioned the 2-10 thing. I can't not bring it up. It irks me that people keep saying it's a 2-10 team and they turn around and beat Alabama. They were an undefeated regular season team 2 years ago. And people need to put a little respect to that name. People thought Norvell was a joke. They brought in DJU. They were not good last year. The defensively were terrible. They just kind of collapsed on themselves, quit on the team, et cetera, et cetera. But 17 new players for Florida State this year. This is a completely new squad, just like it was a completely new squad the year prior. And given that it's completely new, why do we think, we're so obsessed with what you did last year rather than the continuity of the coaching staff, continuity of the program? People view it completely differently, right, this year versus if Florida State last year had played Alabama in the opener and beat them after they were undefeated. Again, keeping in mind basically a complete roster overhaul either way, right? It's all new players. It could have easily been the same team last year. So a big part of all this is that I think Florida State is just being viewed as a trash team and look what they've done versus Alabama. And people are just barely wrapping their heads around maybe Florida State's actually good. We don't know either at this point, but we may even come back to it because I think there are a lot of things I want to talk about positive, but I have to interject that first because I feel like there's so much of a focus on what Alabama did wrong that nobody wants to admit that Florida State did a lot of things right. That said, the thing that really hurt Alabama, I think, from the injury perspective, you got injuries to Jam Miller, you had injury to Keenan, their big nose tackle. Obviously, Alabama struggled a lot with a lot of things defensively, but the thing that really killed them was the simple dive play, the inside run play. Florida State consistently got yardage on the inside run, especially on first down, that set them up to be able to attack the edges or do a pop pass or something else over the top. If Alabama had that space eater where they could have been able to stuff some of those interior runs or more importantly, just eat blockers, even on plays to the perimeter, even if Keenan's not a really active guy sideline to sideline, just to eat blockers and free guys to attack the line of scrimmage or attack gaps, it would have made a huge impact. And there were so many little plays in this game that Florida State, who, keep in mind, 5 transfer, fifth-year senior linemen, played at a high level and did all the little things right, and Alabama would make a small mistake, and between them and Castellanos and everything else, they'd capitalize. that broke the back for Alabama defensively in a lot of these drives. They weren't necessarily dominant drives down the field. A lot of them were really grinding drives. This was a 10 possession game on both sides, a short game because the drives were quite long. They weren't really overly explosive at the instant every single time. It was more that they were trying to grind it out, and Alabama would bend and bend and bend and bend until something broke. And more importantly, really got into Alabama's depth, which again, losing Keenan hurt because they ended up with freshmen on the field in key situations where normally that guy that might have been starting in this game would have been the guy rotating in for Keenan rather than that backup rotating in for a third string freshman. The other guy you talked about was Jam Miller, and it was clear throughout the game that Alabama abandoned the run. I think they panicked when they got down early. That's on the coaching staff. It's also an interesting thing because Grubb really got fired at the Seattle Seahawks because he would not commit to the run and because he became too pass happy too often. But Jam Miller was a combination of a run and power they really didn't have in this game. Running against the 3-3-5 is an interesting thing. And there were a lot of times where they could get to the second level 3 to 5 yards deep. Riley was, I think, the number 28, the younger back that did it with some success. But the bigger guys, Richard Young and Daniel Hill that they played with, didn't have the explosion. So when they hit the hole, and there usually was something of a hole, by the time they got through it, let that 3-3-5 collapse down at the linebacker and safety level and sort of stop them. I think in both cases, it would have had a real positive effect. I think Keenan would have a really structurally positive effect for that defense. Offensively, one, Jam Miller I think would have been more effective, but two, I think Alabama would have stuck with the run. And what really happened in this game negative for Alabama offensively, when I went back and rewatched some of it, it was really in the third quarter where they kind of fell apart and just kind of collapsed. They had a mental collapse really in the late third quarter. Up to that point, they've been pretty consistent, but they didn't stick with the run. They didn't try to have a consistent offense, and that was a big part of why they stalled. I think with Miller, one, he'd been more effective, but two, I think they also would have stuck with a game plan. And if they'd run the ball more, look, I don't know that they would have won, but I think they would have looked like a much more coherent offense.
A lot is being said about Ty Simpson and him not having a great game. If you watch the first two drives and the game was still in doubt before Florida State just went on a tear, he actually looked really good. He made good off-platform throws. He made good reads, really strong, drove the ball well. But then two things happened. One, it looked like Alabama at one point it felt like Alabama was not going to force a punt the entire game, which changes the psyche of how you coach, the plays you call, which is why Ty Simpson threw 43 passes. But it also puts a different mental psyche on your quarterback who now knows I've got to score 30, 40 points to win the game in my first start on the road in a crazy environment. Doak was nuts yesterday, to their credit. And that's a lot to put on a first-time starter. It really is. And I think that there's some overreactions there because at some point in the game, I think it was in that third quarter, you saw a shift where, one time he could have easily run for a first down, and instead he pulled the ball out and threw a worm burner. He was holding the ball a lot longer later in the game. A lot of things looked like jitters late that didn't look like that in the first couple of possessions. And some of that's probably script, but some of that is him knowing, crap, the O-line's not blocking great, although a little better than maybe people gave him credit for. I can't run the ball, or the team can't run the ball, and the defense sucks, which means it's all on me. That's a lot to put on a guy who's in his first start. And saying all that, I don't think it's nearly as bad as people are reacting to now. There are still some concerns. And I think there are opportunities. Another thing that people don't maybe realize that, and maybe you can touch on this a little bit, but like scheme-wise, this is one of the few teams, maybe not just the Veer, maybe it is more like, uniquely fast running quarterback, a lot of lateral movement, eye candy, not having Tim Keenan in there. But Alabama's going to destroy Wisconsin in 2 weeks because of the offensive scheme that Wisconsin runs. And people probably overreact in the other direction for Alabama then. Talk about that a little bit, and we'll get into Florida State.
Yeah, we had a whole segment about how I didn't, I had this game as a blowout, right? We were completely wrong on that and who we had predicted. Again, I don't really feel bad about it because it's a Florida State team with 17 new starters. We did not know who they would be. To your point, Daniel, it's hard to say whether or not we were completely wrong or I was completely wrong in thinking Alabama's deficiencies last year versus Veer teams wouldn't happen versus this Malzahn scheme. Obviously, it did, but did it happen in the same way? And I'll tell you, that was the weird thing I saw on tape. When you look last year, right? What made Alabama a bad team last year? Let me throw out some numbers, okay? So if I told you that Alabama versus Florida, 2.28 yard per carry, 6.04 yards per attempt. Does that sound about right?
Versus Florida?
Florida. You're already getting the hint. Those are the numbers Alabama had going in the last two drives versus South Florida last year. 2 or 3 drives. I forget which. They scored 3 touchdowns late. Before those last 3 scores, they were at 2.28 yards per carry, 6 yards per attempt. These things we saw in the Florida State game from Alabama aren't as new as people want to make them out to be, but it's also not as uniquely suited to the opposing defense and scheme as people want to make it out to be. Having a lot of young players in, rotating and screwing up, was something they did in their opener against South Florida. The difference with South Florida in that game was Byron Brown for South Florida couldn't hit the broadside of a barn, but they had guys running free, as I recall from early in that game. But remember, that was a game where Alabama looked like, that's why I recall it, they looked like they were going to lose late. I mean, they went into the fourth quarter 13-14, down up a point on South Florida, and it wasn't until the very end of the game that they blew them open. I mean, this has been a trend. And what I will say for Alabama, when you view it that way, is I think the scheme matters. But one, I think it matters because the inside linebacker play was terrible. When I went back and rewatched it, Lawson, number 0 for them, is supposed to be their stud. He's clearly not healthy. He's maybe 80%, can't run. So he can't pursue laterally in this game. The linebacker Jefferson that replaced Campbell, went in the first round of the draft, seemed completely lost. Seemed to be pretty fast, but clearly a massive downgrade from Campbell in this game. And then they had a transfer from Colorado who's just not very mobile and couldn't contain laterally. Those are all new problems. They weren't the same issues they had last year. If you look at the last year's game against Vanderbilt, I mean, the thing that I think flies under the radar there is they stopped the run fairly well against Vanderbilt, right? It wasn't the Veer rushing attack or the inside run game that really killed them. And I'm pulling up the box score right now. Vanderbilt ran the ball for 3 yards a carry in the game. Their star running back had 64 yards and 20 carries. Pavia had 56 on 20. They lost the game because they gave up 12.6 yards per attempt, 250 yards on just 20 passes. This was a very different ball game. They got hit a couple times through the air. One in particular, just on a wheel route, but that was all happening because they were getting gashed on the ground. It was due to linebackers with a very different set of problems. They have an injured linebacker, the other one not being very good. Wasn't the same thing as they had happened last year. So it's a lot of new and a lot of old. And on some of this, Daniel, you talk about not being as bad. Again, I think they looked worse to open last season, and they were one of the best defenses in the country to end the year. They were terrible versus South Florida, just lucky they couldn't throw the ball. They were awful versus Vanderbilt in a very different way. I think this was more injury related for them. I think the scheme exposed real deficiencies at linebacker that they're either going to solve through personnel or health. They're going to get a better nose tackle, and it's also a unique scheme to exploit all that. And Daniel, this is where I'd really like to get into Florida State, because I think Florida State had a lot of players. They had speed at quarterback, they had speed at running back, they have speed at receiver, that when you combined all that together was uniquely able to exploit these deficiencies that Alabama had and the lack of assignments. Again, I don't think Alabama's D-line was even that bad when I went back and watched it. Not really. And I watched the game with a former starting center from cousin from a big player, one of these games playing right now. And, he commented, look, the D-line's really doing their job. The linebackers just can't fill. And a lot of the reason they couldn't fill was all the stuff Florida State did right, the scheme Florida State did, how well they executed it, and the pieces they had to run it.
Yeah, I think that a lot of the shock, back to what you were saying earlier, is people saying, well, Alabama just got worked by a 2-10 team. And to your point, we have the Florida State of 2 years ago that did a ton of transfer portal work and it worked. And then we have 1 year ago where it didn't work. So you don't know what you don't know. And we took the line that the transfer portal wasn't going to save them enough to beat an Alabama. Obviously, it did. I think also adding Gus really helped out a lot. They looked better defensively too. But in this game, there were a couple of very crucial penalties and there were a couple of very big plays that if they don't break the way they broke, this is a really tight game. And that's not to take anything away from Florida State because I still think Alabama's a good football team. But to your point, they added a lot of speed and they added really what has been classically considered as like SEC speed and athleticism that they didn't have last year, that they did have a lot of 2 years ago. And I looked down their schedule. We talked about this earlier, Josh. I wouldn't be surprised if this scheme isn't quite as effective against some of the defenses they play this year, but I do think it's going to be really good. And I wouldn't be shocked if this Florida State team goes 10-2 and makes the playoffs. And that is a thing that I would not have said a week ago. Like I picked Alabama to win, I think by 16 points, partly because I was really high on Alabama, but also because I wasn't that high on Florida State. And so while I do think this game was probably a little closer than the score indicated and could have been a little better in week 6 or 7, I also came away from this game thinking a lot more people need to be talking about Florida State than just talking about Alabama sucking. Because I think if you say Alabama sucks, and I kind of think I've alluded to it last night, and I overreacted. If you say Alabama sucks, you take away a lot from what good there is to say about Florida State. And in this game, they earned this win, and they did exactly what they needed to do. And to a point you were saying before we started rolling, they executed in a way that you really don't expect transfers to be able to execute in week 1, and that's a testament to this coaching staff.
Yeah, again, 5 transfer offensive linemen, all fifth-year seniors. When we did the preview, my assumption was these guys running Malzahn's scheme would not be able to execute it at a high level in week 1. And they did. There were not a lot of misblocking assignments. They weren't running into each other in the backfield. Florida State looked like a well-oiled machine with a set of transfer starters. That was the thing that really determined this game. It's so easy to take for granted how many times Florida State was in the right position to make the right play and made it. How many times they had a wheel route out of the backfield, it was timed correctly, they hit the guy, he runs down the field, he scores. It's easy to take for granted that the guy running the wheel route down the field is also Jalen Lucas, who was a very small guy, receiver, running back, wasn't really utilized well in the prior system, but in Malzahn's scheme, which has a lot of jet sweep components where they have really one main inside ball carrier and they like to have a gadget speed guy. Corey Grant was their guy, if I recall correctly, in 2013 that never really got recognized for who he was because everybody was focused on the rest of that offense. Those are the guys that make that scheme work. And when they compare, they paired like Jalen Lucas, they paired, Micah Danzy, and they paired them with, transfers and Sawchuk, Roydale Williams. The combination of those guys all doing their role is what made it effective. And something I talked about in the preview before was that Castellanos didn't really have big rushing games last year. I think he had one game over 75 yards. Something under the radar, he only had 78 yards rushing in this game. Castellanos was a huge key to what they did because of his ability to convert in unique situations and avoid negative plays. I don't think Castellanos alone would have won him this game. I mean, again, 78 yards, 4.9 yards per attempt, 1 touchdown. His longest run, Castellanos' longest run in the game was 14 yards. He was not a major factor with his legs. And even throwing, the thing that made him work throwing the football is he made the right decisions at the right time. He popped the ball out, he made good reads, and he hit some of his pop passes. Hit one downfield shot early when he saw one-on-one where a guy got beat. Alabama was inexplicably having a true freshman in a 3rd and 11 in a key situation early in P4 game. It seems like coaching malpractice. Yeah, but that was them doing what they needed to do. And it's so easy to take for granted that, yeah, Squirrel White, Castellanos played a lot of football, made the correct read that we've got a one-on-one with a freshman, steps back 2 steps and took his shot quick. It was decisive and it was catchable. That play doesn't get thrown a lot and it doesn't get caught a lot. Sometimes it's overthrown. Florida State did that right the whole game. And if that's who they are, if they're executing at that level, I made this comment to you, Daniel. Like Georgia Tech comes in with a lot of hype on that offense with Haynes King, how they played versus Colorado. Florida State, in almost all phases of this game offensively, is a better version of Georgia Tech. They have a better runner in Castellanos. They have a better offensive line. They have better receivers with Deuce Robinson and Squirrel White. And even though they didn't catch a ton of passes, I want to give a shout out to the fact Deuce Robinson was driving guys downfield. Big receiver transfer from USC. They're good. They're just good all around offensively. Defensively, they got a lot of pressure in Alabama. This is where I'll say in the secondary when I went on rewatch, I will say I've got some questions about how good the pass defense really is because there were a lot of guys open a lot. They just didn't give Alabama the time to hit them. Now, being able to stop the run was a huge change because they were a horrible run defense last year. They were very, very, very good in this game. The ability to get pressure is huge. I'll be curious how well the secondary does or does not hold up an ACC play. But Daniel, again, put some respect on this name. Florida State played winning football. This was, from what I've seen so far, really Miami is the only other offense I think maybe on the tier of what they could be. Again, not knowing quite what Alabama was, what was right or wrong. I don't think, Daniel, this is a Vanderbilt 2024 situation with Alabama. I really don't. I don't think this is a game where their defense was just horrid and making stupid mistakes. I think Florida State's just good. I think this Florida State team is a borderline playoff team. I think they have a very good shot of going 9-3 or 10-2. I think the defense is going to be the real question in the back seven, more so even maybe than the front seven, though it may be defense overall. But offensively, I think they're going to be extremely hard to stop for teams all year. The Castellanos can be up and down. They're going to be in games against better physical front sevens with better linebacker play where they're going to have to throw it. It's going to be interesting to see how well they can do it. But in the ACC, with this schedule only having at this point, you go down the schedule, Daniel, you got one ranked game against Miami, one ranked game against Clemson, and a ranked game to end the year currently against Florida. Otherwise, East Texas A&M, Kent State, Virginia, Pitt, Stanford, Wake Forest, Virginia Tech, NC State, very manageable for them to get to 9-3, and they can get to 9-3 now without winning another ranked game. This is a Florida State team that I think is going to finish ranked and probably going to finish ranked pretty highly if they play.
Yeah, and they need Alabama to be good too, and that gives them even more breathing room because they've got that win in their belt, and that's why scheduling these big games can help you. Florida State's got 3 good teams left on their schedule that could beat them. If they win one of those, I think they're in the playoffs.